Hey everybody, Phil here. Today we're going to talk about exploitability and incentives and how that relates to figuring out how a solver might play and how you would like to play. So firstly, I'll kind of define what I mean when I speak about incentives. When I say incentives throughout this course, I'm going to mean when we take a certain action that is different than what the solver takes, what does that incentivize our opponent to do? How are we exploitable and in what way? Now, it's not always just about exploitability and deviating from the solver. I like to think that the solver thinks about incentives as well when it's determining its optimal strategy. Obviously, as I'll keep making the disclaimer, solver doesn't actually think, but this is the logic I'm putting to it. So a big factor in the solver coming up with its strategy, if it were a human, in my opinion, is, well, what if I were to do this? What would the optimal counter strategy be? Oh, I can't let that happen, so I can't do that. All right, so there are three reasons that we're going to focus on incentives, three ways in which we're going to use them. The first is to help us figure out what solver strategy might be. So the example I'll give you here is, let's say that we're on the river in position, and I think that I want to value bet this hand or better. Let's call it two pair or better. And then I realize going through my range, well, I think I have two pair or better like 50-something% of the time. So that would mean I need to bet that 50-something%, and then I need to have a corresponding appropriate number of bluffs. Let's say I'm potting, so it's, high 20s. So now we're betting 80%. I can't bet 80%. I know that's not right because that would incentivize my opponent to check everything and check raise all check raisable hands and check call. I mean, you get the idea. Now, there are some spots like that come, like very extreme spots. But in this example, I'm analyzing a board that's, in a spot that's relatively normal. And I'll say to myself, okay, well, that can't be right. So I know that I can't value bet that hand, or at least I know that it's not theoretically optimal to value bet that hand. Maybe I can anyways. The second way we'll do it is to intentionally deviate from solver strategy without leaking too much EV. So there'll be times where the solver strategy is too complex and we want to simplify it. It's really important at those points to ask ourselves, what is the exploit to this simplification and how much would it cost us? And the final way is to take maximum advantage of our opponent deviating from optimal strategy. So this is the kind of form of incentives or exploiting opponents that you're used to, and that is talked about all the time in poker. Essentially, our opponent's making a mistake. What can we do to capitalize on it to the best of our advantage? So the way I view it is that there are two distinct types of exploitability. The first type is we're making a mistake. We're deviating from optimal strategy in a way that is leaking a lot of EV against optimal strategy. So this would be bluffing a hand with terrible blockers or calling down on a flush board with across multiple streets with no club in your hand, whatever the case may be. These are things that just lose money, even if our opponent doesn't do anything. The sneakier way, the other way, is we make an adjustment that loses very little against optimal strategy, but opens us up to a counter strategy that causes that adjustment to lose a lot of EV. A is the first example is the obvious one. You just can't punt with terrible hands. The second is the sneakier one, and so that's the one that I focus on a lot, not only in my own play but in my opponent's play. With any adjustment we make, whether it be to our opponent's game, trying to exploit them, or to our default strategy from solver strategy, just trying to simplify, we need to ask ourselves three things. Firstly, what is the exploit to this? What does this incentivize? Second, if our opponent makes that adjustment, how much does that cost us? And then third, how likely is it that our opponent will make that adjustment? There are some adjustments that are just very extreme and unnatural and unintuitive. And then others that are, if you're looking at it away from the game, you might get it. And you might see why it's exploitable and what the correct response would be, but it's really difficult to execute in practice. So taking a random example that I'm sure you can tell is obviously somewhat exploitable. We call a turn probe on king 10, 3, 8 with 2 diamonds. Full pot probe, let's say. River's an offsuit 4, and our opponent checks to us. Now let's say our strategy, our default strategy, and this is made up, but let's say our default strategy is to use half pot as our only sizing, and obviously we'll mix in all of our value hands and an appropriate amount of bluffs. But let's say we decide, you know what, with ace king and ace ace only, I want to bet quarter pot because I don't feel I can get half pot worth of value, but I think I can get quarter pot. So with exactly ace ace and ace king, I'm going to bet quarter pot, and then I'm going to add in the appropriate amount of bluffs. Now, the exploit to that is really complicated. First of all, it's to check some weak 2-pair hands that were otherwise going to bet, that are now going to check call against half pot, but check raise against quarter pot. But you're losing some EV in checking those in the first place because a lot of them were value bets. And secondly, you're only going to encounter this 25% bet a small fraction of the time, so you're not going to get to take advantage of this exploit very often. Then the other exploit that's a little bit easier to do because you don't have to prepare for it with your checking range is that now the ace blocker becomes really useful when you're check calling against the quarter pot bet because ace ace and ace king both contain at least one ace. So that becomes a really good blocker to our value range. These are things that I just don't think you need to worry about any human adjusting to because it's far too complex and it's for far too little EV. Not that I'm recommending that you want to start quarter potting with a very specific hand class. I think that's a bad idea, but it is an example of a way that, we can all see it's clearly exploitable. We can all see that we probably shouldn't do that, but the exploit is too complicated and is just not going to be done. Now, flip positions have us out of position on the river in whatever similar spot and have our main sizing be, let's just stick to the same one. Our main sizing's half pot, but we quarter pot with exactly ace ace and ace king on this same board. Well, now it's actually easier to adjust to because in position didn't have to check these weak 2-pair hands or middling strength 2-pair hands to react to our bet sizing. They have their full range before we bet in that spot. So they get to react and they get to make sure that they raise 100% of 2-pair to quarter pot. And they have a bunch of those 2-pair that wouldn't have raised against the larger sizing. And then, of course, they can still use the blockers in the same way. So sometimes exploitability can happen in very unintuitive ways. There are many examples of this. I'll just give you one. Let's say that in position on the turn, after we've called a 3-bet and called a c-bet, we don't pot fold turn with enough made hands. Now, that's actually a leak that most people have, myself included. What it incentivizes is our opponent to not check raise as many of their made hands and not check raise as many of their combo hands. So a lot of times in 3-bet pots, I don't want to get too deep into this. A lot of times in 3-bet pots, let's say it's, ace queen 7-4 with 2 spades. Turn out of position's check raise range is going to be a lot of, ace queen, some lower sets, things like that. And then top pair plus spades or top pair plus wrap or something like that. And if we're not bet folding, let's say top and bottom pair ever, or some other hand in that category, we're not incentivizing enough check raises, specifically with the semi-bluff portion of the range. Now, if we're not pot folding them because we're always calling them, then we still incentivize the check raises for value. And if we're not pot folding them because we're not betting them at all in the first place, then we just incentivize no check raises with either portion of the range. A lot of people might say, okay, who cares if my opponent doesn't check raise semi-bluff enough? I don't like when they check raise, so that's fine. But first of all, it's how you know that there's something wrong in your game, at least as far as optimal strategy is concerned. But second of all, those things do cost you, and sometimes they cost you in unintuitive ways. So yes, you're not going to get check raised as much on the turn, but you're betting a range that doesn't care if it gets check raised because it's mostly hands that are very comfortable folding and hands that are very comfortable calling. What you're incentivizing is instead, first of all, for out of position to not make those semi-bluffs. So you're made hands lose some value. But secondly, and more importantly, you're incentivizing out of position to bet a lot of those hands that would have been check raises in the first place, which is costing your turn check back range a lot of EV, because they were going to get to check back and realize equity against a range that is, consists of those very strong hands that are now going in the betting range, charging your made hands, charging your draws, and extracting value from you. So in the last video, I talked to you about the concept of needing to check certain hands to not allow value bets that quote unquote shouldn't happen. What I mean by that is, if you don't check enough of a certain hand category, now your opponent gets to value bet hands that they should have no business value betting, and then they get to gain a lot of EV with these plus EV value bets that shouldn't be able to happen. Now, I talked about a river example, and we're going to get into a river example like that and take a deep dive soon. But first, I wanted to show you this turn example and talk you through it because it's a little bit simpler. So in this example, flop is ace jack 8 with 2 diamonds. In position has called a 3-bet and called a 2/3 pot c-bet. Note, by the way, this is from a pre-flop solve, so the strategy is going to be a little bit blunt, imprecise, but the concepts all still apply. It's still going to be roughly accurate. Turn is a 10 of diamonds. Out of position checks. In position has to decide what to do. And so talking about the hand category of flushes, in this spot with nut, second nut, and third nut flush, in position is betting 90% of the time. It's almost never checking those hands. Yet with weaker flushes, in position is checking a bunch, like almost all of them. So part of the reason you check flushes on this turn, in addition to not being able to get as much value, but you need to check certain flushes because you don't want to allow out of position to start value potting the nut straight on this turn. And if you look at the river strategy, you'll see that out of position does not bet king queen on the river. Out of position does pot every flush for value. That's the minimum value bet is any flush. And then king queen is not a value bet, it's just a check. And so solver's in position strategy accomplishes that. Now, what I talked about in the last video and what I'm talking about again is you don't need to check stronger flushes to prevent out of position from potting king queen. Your weaker flushes accomplish that just as well. Checking stronger flushes could disincentivize your opponent from value betting weaker flushes, but you would have to check so many in this spot and give up so much turn EV that it's not worth it. Out of position can still value pot in this spot every flush, not because you're betting so many of your stronger flushes, but because of blocker effects. The flushes have 2 diamonds at least in their hand, and that's going to drastically reduce the number of flushes you have in position. So in order to counteract that and not allow your opponent to pot those flushes, you would have to check so many strong flushes that, well, you'd be giving up a lot of EV first and foremost, and second of all, now you're kind of changing out of position strategy and disincentivizing them from betting hands that, anyways, it would take me a long time to go through all of it. But you get the idea. Don't protect your range by checking these like third nut flushes that can very comfortably bet for value. Yes, sometimes we need to check back hands because we need a river raising range, and absolutely we need to do that sometimes. Usually, in like deeper stack scenarios, it's more important that you do that with the literal nuts than the third nuts that you can bet. It varies, obviously, but in these shorter SPR scenarios, you don't really need the nuts to raise the river. And there's also just not much money left to raise the river, so that it's not as important a part of your strategy overall. So yeah, make sure that you're not slow playing the wrong hands that can get 2 streets of value. Just rely in a lot of these spots on your weaker hands, that are your weaker flushes rather, your kind of like weaker tier 1 hands that can protect your range such that your opponent doesn't get to value bet you to death. So as promised, here we are on the river. And we're going to take a deep dive into this strategy. I actually ran this spot just to show you one concept, but the whole strategy is very interesting and actually covers incentives in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to go through it. So flop is 9-3 deuce, 2 hearts, turn is a queen of hearts, river's an offsuit 5. It's been checked down to the river in a single raise pot. So button raise, big blind called, check, 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 check. And now we're on the river. What I wanted to show you is that out of position never checks a flush to check call. And a lot of people do this. They get there with like, oh, I have a queen and a 4, so I'm blocking stuff. So with my jack high flush, or like my 7 high flush, I'm just going to check call. Solver does not do that. When the solver checks a flush, it's, I think, roughly 10 high flush or stronger, maybe some random 9 high flushes, to check raise. It only checks a flush to check raise. You do not need flushes in your check calling range. Does nothing for your check calling range. Doesn't prevent your opponent from being able to value bet the hands that they can value bet. It doesn't do anything for you. Similarly, 6-4 essentially never checks. Checks a few % of the time, but 6-4 just always pots out of position. Doesn't serve your check calling range well. Doesn't serve your small betting range well either. Now here's where it gets actually pretty interesting, because I thought that that ace-4 would be kind of similar to 6-4, or maybe it would go with some pots, some small bets based on the blockers. But ace-4 actually pots half the time and checks half the time. And I found that strange because, like 6-4, it didn't seem like it would serve the check calling range well. And it doesn't small bet, which is interesting too, because obviously it's strong enough to small bet if some of the ace-4 combos are strong enough to pot. So right there, I asked myself as I was looking through it, why would it be doing that? It has to be serving the check calling range in some way that is not obvious to me. So we'll get into that in a little bit. For the rest of out of position strategy, it's checking queen queen, queen 9, and 9-9 to check call due to the extreme blocker effects. A lot of the calls from in position and out of position, for that matter, contain a queen or a 9. Those are like very key cards for calling. 9-5 through queen 5, so basically 9-5 plus 2 pair, essentially always bet small. Like I think it was almost literally, or maybe literally, always bet small. Again, those don't serve your check call range super well, and they can get value, so they do. So in order to solve that ace-4 mystery, let's look at imposition strategy a little bit. I gave it half pot only. At first, I did run it with a couple of sizings. It almost always used half pot, so went with half pot only. Obviously, every flush is betting, every straight is betting. So and every set is betting, for that matter. So where's the value threshold? It looks like it's 9-5 is the minimum value bet, almost. So 9-5 bets, 9-5 through queen 3 bets only about half the time, and it's kind of equally distributed, perhaps to not make any blockers too powerful for out of position. Queen 5 plus always bets. And then another interesting thing is that in position value bets aces or kings 10% of the time, and it actually, out of the kings and aces get check called by a queen or a 9, and they fold out very weak 2 pairs sometimes. So it's kind of a very strange bet. It only does it 10% of the time, but it's part of the strategy. So part of the really interesting thing to me is that these hands, 9-5 through queen 3, are only betting half the time. And there are a couple of things that out of position is doing to not allow those, to restrict those from betting more often. First of all, the check raises, obviously. And then second of all, the ace-4. Third of all, ace-4. Second of all is the queen-queen, 9-9, and queen 9. But ace-4 being in that checking range when I guess it was getting kind of close to, slightly plus EV value bet, it's helping because it unblocks those 2 pair, and it's making those 2 pair lower EV to bet. And then the kind of 1-2 punch of checking the ace-4, I should say 1-2-3 punch of checking ace-4, checking the queen-queen, 9-9, and queen 9, and then checking the check raises, which is kind of obvious part of anyone's strategy, is reducing the EV of those and forcing imposition to check some of them. Also, of course, if imposition were to bet all of those, they are kind of similar in EV to each other. So the ones that are checking and the ones that are betting are not, the value bets are not making that much, and the checks would have been able to like break even or make a similar amount perhaps. But that would incentivize out of position to check far more flushes and more ace-4 for that matter, and then check raise the flushes as well as a corresponding number of bluffs. Out of position can value bet, I believe, can value bet some weaker 2 pair. It starts to get kind of thin with for a small sizing, but the combination of checking some of those, checking some ace-4, check raising flushes, prevents in position from being able to value bet ace, ace, and king, king. And actually, I think that might be a key part of this strategy for out of position, because the ace, ace, and king, king value bets are really powerful. If out of position is check calling with a queen, check calling with a 9, a lot of the time, and then check folding weak 2 pair. It just makes aces and king value bets too powerful. So keeping those to 10%, I think might be kind of an important part of out of position strategy. The only other thing I wanted to point out, which might surprise some people, so against pot, in position is raising 5% of the time. So first of all, that's, in position is check back some nut flushes to raise, but also in position can raise thinner than the nut flush, I think down to the 10 high or jack high flush on this board. I forget. But against a small bet, it's raising 23% of the time, which I think for some people might strike you as very high. But in my sim, out of positions betting quarter pot, third pot would be fine as well. And in positions raising half pot, which means that, into a pot of 6 big blinds, out of positions betting 1.5 big blinds, in position is raising to 6 big blinds. So it's as if in position is bet pot when check 2. And if you do the math on that, when in position is facing a check, in position bets 46% of the time for half pot. So roughly a quarter pot, put in, a little bit less than a quarter pot put in. Actually, if we want to just do the exact max, it's 23% put in by betting when facing a check. And now, since it's raising 23% of the time to the amount of full pot, it's also putting in 23% of the pot against a small bet. So there are things like that where, if you raise only 10% of the time in position, well, now you're incentivizing out of position to use that small bet with all of its 2 pair and hands that can, so that it prevents in position from putting in as much money and putting as much pressure on you. Similarly, if you are raising 23%, but then you're only betting 30% against a check, then you're incentivizing a lot of checks from hands that don't want to face heat. Now, if it seems like this is a lot to keep track of, putting in the right amount of money against a check, putting in the right amount of money against a bet, and of course, out of position is doing the same thing, balancing how much they're putting in with bets and how much they're putting in with checks against a half pot sizing, against full pot sizing, how often they're raising against each one. It is a lot to keep track of, and you're not expected to. None of us can. Don't get discouraged by how complex the game tree is. Get excited by how complex it is, because no matter who you're playing, even if you're playing the best player in the world, they can't handle this. It's just way too much for a human to do. So if you are studying hard and if you are focused when you're playing, you are going to find holes in your opponent's game to exploit. So hopefully you're as excited as I am about that, and we will carry on. See you in the next video.